investing matters a lot when you have a lot of money, and saving matters a lot when you don't have a lot of money. So when I say savings for the poor, investing's for the rich, I mean this on an absolute sense. So like if you're young or you don't have a lot of assets invested, the only lever you can really pull right now to change your wealth is your savings and your labor income and saving money and getting it invested, right? But as you gain wealth, then you can go and then your investments matter. Then you have to focus so much more on those investments.
T-minus 10 seconds.
Welcome to the Journey to Launch podcast with your host, Jamila Souffrant. As a money expert who walks her talk, she helps brave journeyers like you get out of debt, save, invest, and build real wealth. Join her on the journey to launch to financial freedom in
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Journey to Launch is supported by First Republic Bank. A seamless banking experience is something we all want, but what does it really mean? At First Republic, it means you have access to your own personal banker, someone who knows your name and is there for you when you need them. I know at any time, I can just reach out to my personal banker, Linda, with any questions that I have. It's amazing to know that I won't get the runaround by the automated voice recordings and number prompts that lead you to a dead end, that I don't have to be put on hold for hours before I can speak to an actual person. Whether you're browsing their full suite of services or just have questions about your bank statement, you can reach out to your personal banker by phone or email and through the best-in-class banking app. See what a difference an always-on seamless banking experience can make for you. Visit firstrepublic.com today to learn more. That's firstrepublic.com. Member FDIC, equal housing lender. If you want the episode show notes for this episode, go to journeytolaunch.com or click the description of wherever you're listening to this episode. In the show notes, you'll get the transcribed version of the conversation, the links that we mentioned, and so much more. Also, whether you are an OG journeyer or brand new to the podcast, I've created a free jumpstart guide to help you on your financial freedom journey. It includes the top episodes to listen to, stages to go through to reach financial freedom, resources, and so much more. You can go to journeytolaunch.com/jumpstart to get your guide right now. Okay, let's hop into the episode. Hey Journeyers, I'm excited to have today's guest in the rocket seat. We have Nick Maggiulli on the podcast. He's the Chief Operating Officer and Data Scientist at Richholtz Wealth Management, where he oversees operations across the firm and provides insights on business intelligence. He's also the author of DollarsAndData.com, a blog focused on the intersection of data and personal finance. He's also the author of a book we're going to be talking about, Just Keep Buying, which I actually got a chance to read most of it and I really enjoyed it. So I think that you're going to really enjoy this conversation. So welcome to the podcast, Nick.
Thank you for having me on. Appreciate it, Jamila.
Yeah. So, okay, Nick, when I was reading the book, you said you started your blog in 2017. You started blogging.
Mm-hmm.
And before we pressed record, we talked about kind of like both of us entered into the space around the same time. I started with a podcast. You started with a blog. Your blog is actually very popular from what I could see. You have tons of Twitter followers and people who really read and respect your work. And so when I was introduced to you by our common friend, and I checked out your blog and then I actually read the book, I was like, oh, like no wonder why he's so popular, because I felt like you had a fresh take on the concepts that we talk about so much and we hear other people in the space talk about. And I wanted to understand for you, like your love for finance. Where did that come from? And then wanting to have a blog and even go deeper, right? Some people just like do it for their own personal gain. They fix their own finances. Is that it? Or they're on the sidelines watching, but you like enter the space with your own platform. Talk about your decision to do that.
Yeah, so I've always like been into like math, like as a little kid and stuff, but I realized like a lot of the math we learn in school isn't that useful. I can't remember the last time I've had to think about like an isosceles triangle or something like that, or right angle. Like, yes, some people will use that if you're in construction or an architect or whatever, but like I always like finding things that are applicable and real. And so I remember when I first learned physics, I was like, oh, this is like the real world. I can drop something and estimate how long it takes to hit the floor or something, right? And I think with the thing about like why I really got into personal finance, I got into economics, and I really just got into money because like it affects everybody. Like every single person listening to this, even people not listening to this, are affected by money. Like it's a universal language. Like I don't care what religion you have or whatever, money is a concept that everyone on the planet knows, and they know it very well. So I think because it's so universal, it's something that has affected my life. It's affected, I know it affects everybody's life. And so I'm into numbers. I'm like, where can I take numbers and apply it to to the most number of people? And I think that's got to be in personal finance, investing, things like that. So to me, it seems pretty obvious, like why it's so valuable to everybody. But I just enjoy it too, because and I actually like the mathematics behind this stuff. It's very simple. You don't need calculus to do all this stuff. You really just need to know how add, subtract, multiply, divide, and then a little bit of compounding, which is obviously just like multiplication type stuff. So that's basically it. And you can kind of get the math down to do this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, my kids are pretty young, but they're starting, the math concepts now. But this is the kind of stuff we should have learned in school for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
With that, right, you write this book and, you start out the book with the story about your grandfather, which I really like, that he had a gambling. I don't know if you did, would you say it's an addiction?
Oh, yes. Oh, definitely. It's one of the worst. I've read on this a little bit, and his was pretty bad. I don't think it's the worst I've ever read, but it's up there. So, yeah, he had an addiction for a long time. And when I was a little kid, so I didn't know. Like, we'd be at the horse races. I'm watching the ponies run around. I'm a little kid. I love it. I'm like, oh, look, they're running, I have no idea a concept like, oh, my grandfather's been doing this for years, and he's throwing away a bunch of money and all that. That was foreign to me, but that's kind of my first interaction with understanding money was kind of in that context, which was interesting.
And then you talk about, for you, seeing him and then on him spending his money, all his retirement income on gambling, like he died with nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you know the concept "die with zero." Like I'm sure you know that book, right?
Yeah, yes.
And you do address this in the book a bit about oversaving. But when you were talking about this story, I was wondering, apart from the addiction side of it, was there a part also where it was like, this is how he wanted to spend his money down to zero? Or do you feel like there was something else there?
Well, I think the die with zero idea is very different because it's like you start with some money and then you want to give it away and kind of live the life you want and then die with zero. That's kind of the idea. Versus he didn't really have money. He had income streams and he just blew it all like consistently over years. And I was like, there's nothing wrong like with gambling necessarily, but like there's so much more he could have done with it. And I think like he still could have gambled. He just had to like literally halve his bet size. It wouldn't have changed. Like he still could have done all of that stuff, gotten the entertainment out. He could have done all of that without having to like throw all that money away. You know what I'm saying? And so even in the book, the analogy I give is if he had just taken half his money, invested it in the US stock market, he would die with $1 million. And that's not the point to die with $1 million. Obviously, I just wanted to illustrate like how he could have still done the same stuff and he could have like built wealth even despite being a gambling addict, which shows like the power of stocks and stuff like that.
Right. And you start with that story, I think, because you talk about these two foundational concepts in building wealth, saving and investing. So I do want to like focus on that and then define first what's saving and what's investing, because I find depending on who's saying it, it can tend to mean different things, especially the saving part.
Yeah. So I think how I would define saving is like, okay, obviously you have some sort of income coming in, you have some sort of expenses, and what's left over is kind of what you would save. That could just be cash for now, but I think that's savings. And then once you take that money and buy some sort of income producing asset, whether that's a stock or a stock index fund or some sort of real estate or farmland or royalties on a song. I mean, there's a lot of different things you can buy, but once you get that invested, now you're technically investing. Once that money has an option of providing a return to you, that's where I think investing comes in. Because while it's in cash, it can't provide a return. I mean, yes, there are CDs and things like that, so there are exceptions to this, but generally, I would even say a CD is a type of investment because it's locked up and you're not supposed to be able to access it.
Right. That's a good basis to start our conversation, because one of the quotes you have, and I love that you have like these quotes, like you kind of buck against the standard norm of what sometimes personal finance people say, or you just make definitive statements, which I like. So one of the things you say is saving is for the poor, investing is for the rich. And I'd love for you to break that down. I know it's very absolute and there's obviously nuances in there, but I think it's important for us to explain what that means and then we can dive deeper.
So I mean it on both an absolute sense and on a relative sense. So let's go through both of those. So What I talk about in that first chapter is called the Save Invest Continuum. And every person listening to this, every person is on this continuum. And all you need to know where you are is you need two numbers, right? The first number is like, how much money can you save in the next year, right? So let's say you could save $500 a month, next 12 months, that's $6,000, right? So that's your first number. And then the second number is like, how much can your investments return you in the next year? So let's say you had $10,000 invested, you expect to get a, let's say 10% return. I'm just making the numbers easy here. So you expect to get $1,000 next year. That's your second number. So remember, your first number, how much could you save, is 6,000. Your second number, how much could your investments generate for you in a decent year, is 1,000. So which one's bigger? In this case, the 6,000 is bigger, right? And so what that means is if you can save 6,000, you should take that money and then get that invested so you can raise the other number. So over time, though right now your investments are only paying you 1,000 a year, if you keep investing and get that number higher and higher over time, that number should go higher to the point where once you're like older, and we can just use an extreme example in a second here. Once you're older, you should be able to generate more from your investments than you could ever save. So let's use an extreme example. In the book, I talk about when I was 23, I had $1,000 to my name. I had all these spreadsheets. I was trying to figure out, how much bonds should I have? How much stocks? I was obsessed. I was neurotic, right? But I didn't realize, like, even if I got a 10% return on $1,000, that's $100. Like, I could make that, in, how many hours, even minimum wage, you work one day and there's $100, right? I mean, not after tax, but let's just get close, right? It's getting close to that, right? So one day of work, I could have made that my investment return in a year. I was blowing it, going out with friends and, going to dinner and having shots and all this stuff and like partying as a young 22-year-old. Like, I was blowing my investment return in one night easily. And now compare that to someone with like $10 million, right? If they had a 10% decline or a 10% gain in their portfolio, that's $1 million. Like, to save $1 million after taxes is very, very difficult unless you have a super high income, right? So, you can see like in the extremes, like it's very obvious. Like, so investing matters a lot when you have a lot of money, and saving matters a lot when you don't have a lot of money. So when I say savings for the poor, investing's for the rich, I mean this on an absolute sense. So like if you're young or you don't have a lot of assets invested, the only lever you can really pull right now to change your wealth is your savings and your labor income and saving money and getting it invested, right? But as you gain wealth, then you can go and then your investments matter. Then you have to focus so much more on those investments. And so it's just about figuring out where you focus your time based on where you are. So even when I say savings for the poor, like I said, I was poor when I was 22. I don't mean I was in abject poverty. I was not, trust me. I was, I had great privilege, I had great education stuff. I was not in abject poverty, but I was poor relative to my future self. And that's kind of the idea I wanted to get across.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you actually clarified, like, it's not like you're trying to, because sometimes when people say things like that, like, oh, don't save your money, invest your money, it's kind of like putting down like the saving aspect of things, which is still equally important, especially like if people are not at the space in which they can invest. They have to save money first to be able to like invest that money or put money aside other than what they're spending. So I love that depending on where you are in your life and on this time continuum, like, it's going to matter. One is going to matter more important than the other. And it helps you not waste your time doing things that don't matter or don't give you as much of a return.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I don't get me wrong. It's nice to learn about investing. I'm not discouraging people from learning about investing, spending a little bit of time. Like, that's fine. I think knowledge is useful. Don't get me wrong. But, if you're young or you don't have a lot or you're just getting started, like, don't obsess over it. It's not going to matter that much. What's going to matter more is like, what are you going to do with your career? How are you saving money? Kind of how are you going to try and grow your income to save money? Things like that. I think those are far more important. And that's so I'm saying if I could go back, I would have like, okay, put it whatever into S&P 500, 80-20 portfolio, 20% bonds, and then just not thought about it again. And then just really dug down into like getting better skills, like being a better data scientist or something.
Yeah. Where you're focusing your attention matters. And what you also do is you say this whole idea of like save as much as you can, or save a percentage, right? Like a personal finance rule, right? These rules that are there to help us, maybe encourage us, but sometimes it's discouraging for people. You talk about like, let's just be real for the fact that some people are not even earning enough money to save the rule percentage of 20% or whatever that can be. So you just say, save what you can, right?
Yeah. And I think that's it's for guilt purposes. If you're like, oh, I can't say, you're going to beat yourself up with so much mental stress about not saving that you're not going to enjoy your life. You're probably going to perform worse in your job, which is going to affect your income. If you start thinking about the chain reaction of things that happen, and of course, I don't have data on every piece of this. I have data on like just portions of it. I think the guilt culture is really bad and I just really dislike it. And so I'm like, hey, if you can't save money for the next 2 years because you're not in a great spot or you're not earning enough, that's okay. But think about what you can do to raise your income in the future. And that's the only like, yes, cutting spending can build some wealth, if you're being excessive with your spending or just a little bit in the short term, but it's a short-term solution. It is not a long-term solution. The only way out that I've seen in the data, at least, is growing your income. And so that is a long-term solution. You have to think long-term and say, okay, the next 2 years are going to suck. I'm not going to save anything, but after that, I'm going to do all these things to try and grow my income. So I think that's what people need to focus on. And that's what I try to like talk about.
I love that. And just speaks to just where people can be in different like places as they're listening to this. And I do want to like just go back a little bit. So when we talk about like saving, right? Like if you can't save anything right now in terms of your cash flow. So like, let's say, you're working with like a restricted income. And so you don't have room to save additionally to invest. The idea for then saving for emergencies, how do you feel about that? Like when you think about someone's cash flow and how they're saving, if they can't invest that money, is there a certain amount that they should then save at least for emergencies or have on hand so they're not into like this continuum of putting things on credit card debt or feeling really out of control because emergencies come up in life during that time period where they can't invest?
Yeah, I think having emergency cash, that's like if I have to pick like, in the order of operations of what you do for like, do you max out your 401k or do you get emergency fund? No, emergency cash is number one, right? Because you don't want anything that's going to prevent you from like living your life and doing everything. For example, let's say you don't have emergency cash and you require a car to get to work. That's what many Americans need, a car, some sort of transportation. Your car breaks down. You don't have emergency cash. Now you can't get to work. Now your income's in jeopardy, right? So you have to make sure that as long as you can keep having your income, whatever you need to make sure that that can keep happening. If that makes sure you have a 5,000, 10,000, whatever cash reserve, that's what's important. And I can't remember exactly what I can't remember if I put it in the book. I think I did, where I said the average emergency expense like a couple $1,000s, but they do happen, and they happen like, I think over a 10-year period, the probability of someone having a financial emergency is like 98%. In a 1-year period, it's not that high, but over a 10, if you assume they're independent, like every year kind of just like flipping a coin, so to speak, but the coin is weighted to like a financial emergency, over 10 years, like the chance you're going to have a financial emergency is like almost certain, right? So you're saying, oh, it won't happen to me. It will. It's just a matter of when. And so just kind of prepare for that. And so having that money is incredibly important. And trust me, I'm definitely against credit cards for the most part because like the high interest rate and stuff. But if you're in a bad spot and it's an emergency and you need to do it, remember, there's a real emergency. Not like, oh, these new shoes came out, I had to get them, or this new watch, I had to get this new watch. Like, no, that's not an emergency. Let's be honest. Be honest with yourself. But if you're really in an emergency, like there are times when like you have to use credit cards, you have to rely on things, and you just got to find a way to get out of that. So don't beat yourself up because that's going to harm you more and it's going to make it more difficult to get out of those situations.
Yeah. For me, like in my situation, when I decided to quit my job and leave, like we could not save and invest as much as we did when we were working. So we were not following the rules. We don't really follow the rules anymore. We follow the rules that we make up, right? Like we have guidelines and then you can deviate. But I just think it's helpful because I know if you're listening to this podcast, you probably listen to maybe other personal finance podcasts, and you sometimes do hear this is what you should be doing. But you got to always like transplant like the advice you're hearing to your situation to make sure it's like relative. And if it's not, it's okay to adjust. Kind of like you're releasing people from that feeling of it's legitimately you cannot save or invest right now. It is okay. At least then now focus on your career, your income, so that you can get in a better place.
Exactly. And I think another thing too is like remember, these aren't like my opinions that I'm like, oh, I really believe this. No, it's like I'm looking at data and this is what the data is saying. So what you were just talking about, like when you couldn't save and invest as much when you kind of left your corporate job, like that makes sense because you had obviously your income was fluctuating, right? And so I think a lot of this, you look at the data, like incomes are more variable today than they used to be because we have obviously 2 income earners now versus 1. We used to, I mean, think about it, a lot of the savings advice stuff comes from like the 50s when there was like the husband would work, the wife would stay at home, there was pensions, everything was much more stable in terms of incomes back then. Now it's much more variable. So realizing that things are more variable, the advice has to adapt with it. And I think Save What You Can is much more adaptable. And that's, and I use an analogy in there. There's this analogy with fish. You'll see if you read chapter 2. It's a decent analogy, I think, and it'll explain what they do and how like this is actually kind of copies nature in some ways. Like there's times when to feast and there's times when there's gonna be famine. And you have to kind of like be ready for those types of moments with your financial life.
Yeah, like you have to be financially flexible, not rigid with what you're doing. You just mentioned kind of like, like be real with yourself. Like, it's not necessarily if you cannot afford like to go out and buy something, you're not like to do that. But I do think you address something that's really important which is spending guilt free, and like this kind of push and pull between saving too much, which kind of gets to the die with zero theme of like having too much at the end of your life versus like spending money. And so some of us are in the position where we can like spend money and enjoy our life, but we don't feel comfortable. We feel like we should be saving more, investing more. And I thought you had a great rule. You have this 2 times rule, which helps you spend money without guilt. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so the 2x rule is basically like, let's say you want to spend $100 on, I don't know, something you want to splurge. It doesn't matter what the amount is, whatever. If it feels like a splurge to you, this is what matters. So if you say, hey, I'm going to spend $100 on a very fancy dinner, right? Okay. Instead of just spending that 100 to make yourself feel better, you save another 100, so 200, 2x, and you take that other 100 and you invest it in, let's say, an S&P 500 index fund, or you can donate it. There's different ways you can do this. Like if you're like, hey, if I'm going to spend 100 on myself, I'm going to spend 100 on someone else and help someone else at the same time. So, or if you want to get a nice handbag or a nice watch or whatever it is whatever you consider a splurge, if you just save double the amount of that, and then you'll say like, okay, if I really want it, I'll save double, and then I'll, donate it to either a good cause or I'm going to invest in myself for my future, right? So one way or another, I think these are just little tricks to like kind of get over spending guilt and stuff. But yeah, I just thought this would be helpful for people because I'm just saying my whole thing is like, let's stop with all the guilt stuff. Like this is money. It affects everybody. Like it's a very normal thing. I understand why people feel guilty. At the same time, like I don't think it's healthy for us. I think stress, like I've read a lot on stress. There's a great book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, and it's all about stress. And it's basically like stress impacts people in so many different ways. And I think the more we focus on that, the more it adversely affects us. So I'm trying to get people to stress less about money and like, here's what the data says, like you'll probably be fine, etc.
Yeah. I think and I'm sure even with like your analysis and the data, knowing the strategic things to do, like money, a lot of it is psychological. And you talk about this more, and we're going to talk about it later on or even now, but how, it doesn't matter like how much money you even have. You may never feel comfortable or rich, and you may be sitting or standing from your vantage point now and saying, well, when I get this amount saved and invested, I'll be fine. And then realize when you get there, you'll be like, actually, I need more than that, right? So I think releasing or having these like tricks but that are effective, and whatever that may mean for you, like is helpful so that you can kind of like manage like the emotional toil and like mindset that comes with the spending and saving and investing of money.
Yeah, I agree. And it's funny, there's so many different, like I didn't put everything in the book that I could about not feeling rich. Someone once asked like John D. Rockefeller, how much more money do you need? And his response was like just a little bit more. And that's always like, even rich people like, if I just had 2 or 3x, I promise I would never want any more. But the issue is you're always climbing that ladder. And I think the real thing here is like, as you start to like, let's say level up or whatever you want to call it, like you start to make more money, you're doing better, you're going to start probably hanging out with people who are doing better. And then you're going to be like, wow, they're doing even better. I need to catch up to them. And so it's a game you can play forever if you really want to. I think the key to not playing that game is like kind of realizing where you came from, trying to look at absolute measures and not relative measures. And trust me, I understand like, well, it's always going to feel relative. Like the average person today like has better healthcare and lives better than 1,000 years ago. Like, even the richest person in the world could have died of some random disease that no one could get today because we have cures for it, right? So there's just things like that where like in certain measures, like people are living better today than they've ever lived. But of course, everything's relative too, right? There's a lot of, things there. So we can definitely dig into it more. I think there's a lot more psychology in why people don't feel rich, but it's an interesting topic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it goes along with like this idea of, let's say you're successful, right? Like you're successful in growing your income, getting those bonuses, raises, changing careers, whatever that means. So you're on a trajectory where it's positive. There's a net gain over time. But then it comes to like, then how much of that gain do you spend on yourself versus save? And you do address this in the book. But I'd love to like go over that because I found that it was helpful for me while I was in college, like not earning a lot, that when I didn't get my full-time job, like I kind of kept it very kind of rigid and was able to save a lot. But then, as I got older, as I had more responsibilities and my wants changed, right? Like I didn't want to go on vacation and share a room with 6 of my friends anymore. Like now I want to go and like have a nicer vacation and spend more money. But I think sometimes people get caught up with now, how much of that should I be spending on myself if I got that bonus and raise? Because, hey, I deserve it versus, no, you should be actually saving that. So what's your thought?
A lot depends where you're starting. So, for example, if you're in like deep debt and like really bad debt and you're like, oh, I got to raise, like how much of that? You should probably once you need to get out of that really bad situation. Once you're out of it, I don't mean like, okay, you have some mortgage debt. That's fine. I mean, like you're deep in like credit card debt or something like really high interest stuff. In those cases, you probably got to save everything, but once you're out of that, once you're in a decent spot, this is like the question of someone who's like, hey, I'm saving. I feel like I'm on a decent path of retirement. I'm going to be okay. And that's the people I'm trying to talk to with that chapter, with this raise chapter, because there's a lot of people like, okay, I'm in this decent steady state. We'll call it an equilibrium, whatever you want to call it. And then I have this, what economists call a positive shock. So I got a raise or I got a big bonus, right? So this positive thing happened to me. What do I do with that money? Basically, I've done some simulations which show like, okay, based on your initial savings rate, how much of that raise should you save to kind of retire at the same time? That's the idea, right? Because if you think about a raise, right? If you get a raise, if you save all of it, right, you're going to retire sooner, right? If you save none of it, you're actually going to retire later. And you're saying, well, why is that? Well, because remember, in retirement, let's assume you want to have the same spending throughout your life, right? If you don't save any of it, that means your spending just shot up by the raise amount, right? So if you were spending, let's say, 20 grand a year, and then you got a $5,000 after-tax raise and you save none of it, now you're spending 25 grand a year, right? So that extra 5 grand, that's going in perpetuity till your death, whenever that is. We'll model it in some way, right? But now you're spending that forever and you weren't saving for that in the past, but now you have to save for that. So you have to like delay your retirement. You see that simple, you can understand like how it's affecting your spending is what matters. So anyways, long story short, I run all these simulations and basically like I find that you need to save about half of it, right? It's funny that the numbers kind of got to around 50% and actually kind of funny that also matches the 2X rule. So it's very easy to remember, but as long as you're saving about half of that raise, you can save half and you can spend the other half and you'll still retire around the same point. That's the kind of the key there, right? It's because you're going to keep your spending the same. So you're not only is your spending going to go up now, but it's going to go up into retirement and beyond. And, that 50% rule is very simple and easy to remember. It's like half's for you and then the other half's for future you, right? So that's another way to think about it.
Yeah. And you could also say like maybe with a raise that affects like your continuous paycheck, that's going to impact like ongoing expenses where you can increase like, right? Versus like one-time bonus, that may be a little bit different where that's going to be like a one-time purchase, maybe like a trip or a car or like kind of like those bigger purchases. I think it's important to like separate that out too. Like not all increases are equal depending on where you're raising or putting that extra money to within your desired expenses.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that in the book. I did not, but that's a great point. I mean, I think the raise, I was trying to focus more on the raise because that's where I think most people get. Don't get me wrong, people get bonuses, obviously. I just think the 50%, just use it across the board. It's just easy. It's so easy to remember. I'm just lazy. I don't want to be like, okay, what should we do in this case? But yeah, and it also depends what you're going to do. Obviously, if you get a bonus and you need to take care of something, like, yeah, use the whole bonus and spend it all if you have to. Like, I'm not trying to give these rigid rules like you have to save 20%, you have to save 50% of your raise. There's going to be obviously exceptions to this. But if you're like, hey, I don't know what to do with this money. Like, okay, I want to spend some of it, but like, I don't know. Like, okay, splurge half of it, take the other half and save it, right? That's my argument.
Yeah, I agree.
Today's podcast is brought to you by the Side Hustle Pro podcast. Side Hustle Pro is the first and only podcast to spotlight bold Black women entrepreneurs who have scaled from side hustle to profitable business. Host Nicaila Matthews-Okome highlights the journey of Black women business owners and shares how they got started, how they marketed their businesses, how they keep their businesses growing, and so much more. From figuring out what your side hustle should even be to learning how to turn it into a business, Side Hustle Pro will breathe life into the multi-passionate side hustler in you. And because the ultimate goal is money and time freedom, hello journeyers, that's what we want. Learning how to start and grow a profitable side hustle is something you should be looking into as a means to get to your financial freedom goals. Featured by the Today Show, Oprah Magazine, Forbes, and Apple Podcasts as a top business podcast, it's a must listen to add to your podcast list. Subscribe and check out the Side Hustle Pro podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and wherever you listen to podcasts.
We talk about debt, and I think we kind of have the same view on debt. Like, I don't hate debt. I currently use debt, but in a way that is helpful for me. So I know for certain people, depending on where you are, like it's like, no way, I'm not touching debt. But in some scenarios, like debt can be useful. So let's just talk through a bit, like if one should use debt, like why that can be helpful for them and your thoughts around it.
Yeah, so I think the two most useful pieces for debt are, I'm going to say mortgage debt, and then the second one is, student loan debt. But obviously, the second one's very conditional. Like, I'm going to be very conditional here. It's like, what are you getting with your, when you're getting a degree of some sort? What are you going there for? Do you know if the market even supports that? There's a lot of questions there and how much you're paying. There's a lot of calculations you have to do, but basically I have like a simple formula you can use in there, which is it tries to simplify a lot of stuff, and it basically just says like, okay, if you assume a couple things, here's how much you should be willing to pay for this, right? Going forward. I think that's the key, is like figuring out like, okay, debt can make sense if it's going to, like, for example, if your earnings are, let's say $50,000 a year over 40 years, let's say on average, that's $2 million total lifetime income, right? If going to get a degree is going to double that, now that's pretty extreme. I don't think that's true for most cases, but let's just say that's true. That means $2 million. Okay, that means you'd pay $2 million for your degree. You have to discount all those earnings back to the present. There's all this, and the formula does that. But basically taking that, you can say, okay, maybe I'd be willing to pay like $100,000 or $200,000 for that, at all else equal, right? So it's about realizing, like, is this going to really impact my income? And don't get me wrong, there's people that just, if you want to get an education, like there's some personal pride in that too. So it's not just dollars and cents, but like, if you really are focused on dollars and cents, like make sure that there's some, like, you have some objective criteria. Like, look, without this degree, here's what I would expect to make in the marketplace with these types of jobs. Or find other people that are similar to you that, like, hey, I feel like they're like me and they didn't get a degree and here's what they did. And then here's people like that grew up in my town that got a degree and kind of similar to me and here's what they did. And so you can kind of see the differences. There's ways to do this where you can get a rough idea of how much your earnings might increase as a result of doing that. So in terms of debt overall, like, yeah, I said mortgage debt usually doesn't affect people mentally. There's no stress around that. And then student loan debt, business debt, I don't know as much about that, but I know if you're trying to start a business, sometimes people do that. Other ways you can sell equity. There's different ways of doing that, but those are the types of debt I would recommend. And obviously, like once in a while, if you really, really need it, and it's just a dire straits, like credit card debt can be useful. But generally, I say try to avoid that. Really, the ultimate thing, debt is most useful to, it's kind of ironic, like debt is most useful to people who don't need it. It's like, when you have a lot of money, then you make more money. It like makes no sense. Like, well, I don't have any money and like no one wants to pay me anything yet. Once you have a ton of money, they just give you more money. They give you free, cheaper rates and all that stuff, right? It's the same with debt. The people that don't need debt can use it most effectively. And I think a great example is an extreme example, but when Elon Musk, he was not selling his Tesla shares, he was using them as collateral and he was borrowing against it at a super low interest rate. So he could fund his lifestyle without ever having to sell any shares, which is kind of interesting, right? So he can keep that equity. The equity can keep appreciating and he doesn't have to do he doesn't have to pay taxes or any of that stuff on that type of thing. So that's an extreme example, but I think it illustrates how debt really is for people that don't need it. It's optimal for those people. Like if you can put 20% down, I'm not saying you have to put down 20% down on a home, but like the people that can put 20% down and don't are probably much better off than the people that can't even afford to put 20% down, right?
Right. It's kind of like who wields the weapon. Like it matters who's like holding the sword like that, like how it strikes, because you're totally right in terms of it's a choice. You say this in the book too, like basically, like when it's a choice, that's when it's beneficial. Like when I couldn't buy it in cash, but I choose not to because I rather get that credit card point and just pay it off at the end of the month, I'm in a position of power versus someone who, unfortunately, like they literally don't have an option. Like they have to do this thing. And then I think there's people who don't have an option. It's a necessity. They had to put it on their credit card debt. The people who are just like, oh, this is a splurge, but I can pay it in cash and I'm just going to like leverage that. And then there's that kind of like, you actually shouldn't be doing this. Like, it's not part of your financial goals and it's taking you further away from what you're saying you want to do.
Yeah, I agree. And so I think that having that alignment is important. So if you really want a house and it's like, well, I got to take out debt to own a home, then that's what you have to do, right? There's not really many options. It's very difficult and expensive to own a home straight cash. And I wouldn't even necessarily recommend that, because, if you think about, I talk about this in the real estate chapter, but, you lock in your payment. And if inflation's high, so anyone who bought a home, in 2017, 2018 right now is feeling great because like inflation's going up. In theory, their income should be going up with it in some way, let's hope, but their payment's not. Their house payment is fixed, right? And that's going to be fixed forever. And I use an example of my grandparents, they bought a home in California in like 1972. Trust me, price was much lower than it was like $27,000 for a home. Their mortgage payment was like $270 a month or something, or $280 a month. And within 10 years, due to inflation, that was technically cut in half in real terms, right? So assume my grandfather's pay just was pegged to inflation exactly. 10 years later, his house payment was cut in half based on if his pay doubled basically and his payment didn't move, right? So that's kind of the beauty of like long-term debt is by the end, it's so small that it's minuscule.
Right. Unless in case of people who are over leveraging and buying too much house, then the mortgage does become like the problem. So in all of these like scenarios, whether it's your education or buying a home or buying that bag, like you do have to like be smart.
Of course, yeah. It's always like, the tagline at the top of my book says act smarter, live richer. So that's kind of the idea is like, trying to help people make better decisions with their money and their life. And, it's of course money matters, but like that's just like one piece of the whole thing.
All right, let's talk about another way to be smart with our money, which is investing. So you focus on saving and investing. Investing, let's discuss why people should invest. It's so simple, but I feel like we still need to encourage people.
Yeah, of course. So I think that there's a couple of reasons why people want to invest. The first thing is, well, it's kind of in the news right now, is inflation, right? Inflation's going to, if you're just saving money, that's great. I think that's a good behavior already. But if it's just sitting in cash for a long time, that money is losing value. It's purchasing less goods over time, right? And so what's going to happen is, inflation over let's say the last year, I don't know what's the next print's going to be, but it was like 8.5%. So whatever you could buy before and, all else equal, you're buying 8.5% less of goods with your same, let's say $100 than you could have bought a year prior. And obviously inflation is very disparate in the sense of like certain, maybe gas prices are much higher, but like televisions are lower. So like inflation is very unique how like it affects different goods differently. So that's one thing. You want to preserve your purchasing power to be able to buy the same stuff over time, right? So in the future, you don't have like, you're trying to buy the same thing and it's like, wait, that's way more expensive. So that's why we invest to offset that. That's one reason. Another reason is to save for your future self. That's like a thing. And when you actually look at the data they basically ask people like, why are you saving money? And there's a bunch of different motivations. And the one that's most common or the one that actually helps people save more is not like, oh, save for your kids or save for a vacation. Nope, none of that works. What really works is get people to save for themselves. Be selfish. So when you want to save more money, think selfishly. One of the experiments they did, for example, I don't know if you guys remember, there was like this app called like Face App or Facetune or something where like you had a picture of your face and then they aged you, made you look like really old. I remember this thing happened recently, but this was like before that. They basically used this type of face app. And when people saw older versions of themselves, they started to save more. And so I think it's like thinking about like you're going to probably be an old person one day, so you probably need to save more money. So that's the second thing. So like, we talked about inflation, to preserve purchasing power. We talked about saving for your future self. And the third reason is to like convert your human capital into financial capital. So what do I mean by that? Your human capital is really just like all your skills and time and everything, the value of all that has value right now. And so as you go out and work in the marketplace, you're using those skills to like kind of turn that value you have into financial value, which is the money you're earning, right? And the idea is if you get that money invested, that money is going to start earning you money on itself, right? And so it's what I talked about earlier in the interview with the save invest continuum, right? Early on, you have a lot of human capital, and you have all that and you can save money, and you take that and turn that into financial capital, like investing in stocks or farmland or whatever, income producing assets, such that financial capital can replace your human capital. That's the idea. Is over time, you should be able to earn more money, ideally, from your investments than you could earn in the marketplace one day, like once you're older, once you're in your 60s or something, like you should be able to, if everything goes according to plan, you should be able to have like your investments give you more money than you could like save in a year. That would be ideal, right?
Thank you for breaking that down. And I think it's interesting, like you said, that people said investing for themselves, their future self, is the primary motivator. Because, I've been thinking like how to get people more, like especially even people in my life, like get them more excited about like investing now for their future self. And I find like in real life, yeah, they want to, but it's like, yeah, but I want it now. Like they want to use their money today or enjoy experiences today. And so the human capital, like changing it from human capital to financial capital, I feel like if you can convince people that can happen sooner rather than later, like, yes, it's long term, but that kind of like this idea of financial independence, retire early, which is why I think so many people are like myself was attracted to it. It's like, how can I like shorten that and like have my money working for me faster than in 30 years? That's just something that stood out to me.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something you can do. You got to think about like, hey, if I start getting, start saving more aggressively earlier, like, yes, you can kind of supercharge that. And I understand there is that pull, right? That's why there's this like kind of guilt thing, like, oh, every dollar I'm spending, I could be saving, right? And I understand that. And that makes sense to me. So at the same time, like you want to strike a balance, right? You want to not completely deprive yourself, but at the same time, you also want to make sure that you can live the life you want to live to some extent.
All right, here's the other thing that I know just trips people up and causes them not to even start or just like run in circles is where to invest first, like 401k, Roth IRA. I always like to kind of go back to the basics in case this is like the first time someone is hearing these terms. So can you quickly just define those? But then let's talk about where someone should be looking to put their money first.
Of course, yeah. So in terms of discussing like 401k and IRA, so 401k is going to be an employer-sponsored retirement plan. So your employer will either have one or not, and you'll know. I mean, you probably at this point should know, right? If you don't know, maybe talk to someone in HR and say, "Do we have a 401k plan?" And if you're doing that, basically your 401k is just going to take some money out of your paycheck, every paycheck, and it's going to invest it in, you have to pick something. You have to go pick the options. They're only going to have a limited set of options. You can't pick whatever you want. You can't pick, GameStop or whatever. I'm not recommending GameStop, by the way. I'm just throwing it as an example. So you can't pick whatever you want. You have to kind of look at what are the options that are there. That's with something like 401k or a Roth 401k. That's pre or post-tax. And something like an IRA, that's an account you have to set up on your own, but you get to pick what you invest in, right? And it's also non-taxable in the sense of any of the investment gains will not be taxed, right? So the difference between like an IRA and a 401k and something like a traditional brokerage account is that any gains you have on your investments, let's say you put $100 in, a year from now, let's say it's $110, that $10 is a gain. And so if you sell your investment after a year, you're going to have to pay some tax on that $10 gain, right? So let's say you're in the 15% bracket on the capital gains bracket. That means of that $10, you have to pay $150 to the government and you get to keep the other $850 on the gain, right? And of course, imagine it's like $100,000 and, you get a 15% return, it's 15 grand. Or sorry, a 10% return, that's 10 grand. And then you owe that 15%. So now you're paying $1,500 to the government, you're keeping $8,500, et cetera. So those are the different types of accounts, right? And so where to invest first? Obviously, I think, having some sort of stuff for retirement is very important. So I do recommend people putting money into their 401ks and IRAs, and the 401k, especially if there's an employer match, because that's like free money. So if they're going to match 4%, I would say just due to the match. I have some controversial opinions on whether people should max or not. We can get to that. But I think for the most part, like at least get to the match. And then if you want to do an IRA, you can do that as well. There are sometimes income limits on those. So you got to be careful to make sure you don't make too much money. Then you can't put money into an IRA, things like that. And then, I think where you invest, especially when you're starting, doesn't matter as much. Just get started, find a way to like start saving money and putting it into an account. And, as I said, you can do a target date fund or something, or you can just put it into like, I don't know. I don't want to pick an allocation for people. The issue is there's no right way to get rich. Like there's so many ways that people have gotten rich. Like you can get rich in real estate. You can get rich with farmland. You can get rich with stock index funds. You can get rich. Like I can go down the list. There's a lot of ways to go rich. There's only like a handful of ways to go broke. And that's usually high costs, which is like high spending, high fees, things like that, or high risk, which is like high leverage, or you're concentrated all in one stock or one like penny stock or a random cryptocurrency, like things like that. That's how people go broke, right? And so you want to avoid those things. That's more important. I don't really discuss that in the book, but I think I'm going to put out a bonus chapter that I'm going to release to fans that's going to be like kind of discussing those ideas. So that's the main takeaway there is like, don't worry as much about exactly what you're like. The exact mix doesn't matter too much. Like try and, figure out, okay, I want some amount of risk, but I don't know how much exactly. You got to figure that out. So that's like a stock bond mix. Plus you can have other income producing assets in there. So that's what I would say is like find some mix that works for you. And especially if you're just starting, focus more on your income and your career, because that's how you're going to really start leveling up. It doesn't matter if you're 15% bonds or 30% bonds. That's going to be almost irrelevant for someone who's starting. What's going to matter is like, as I said, income and career.
Yeah. Well, you say to focus more on where you invest, kind of like as you gain assets, as you have a bigger portfolio, right? That's more important there.
Yeah, and I would recommend people open a brokerage account, whether you're going to do that. I'm not going to, I'm not trying to pick there's no right place to go. You can do this at like a lot of places, like, Chase has one, Schwab has one, TD, Fidelity. Like there's so many places you can do this. At Vanguard, you can technically, I think, open a brokerage account, right? And now with Plaid, which I think allows you to connect your bank. So almost any bank you can connect to another just online. You don't have to go in anymore to a branch and physically fill out paperwork, which I think is kind of cool. So I think there's a lot you can do just with like, a brokerage account. So on top of like, yes, you want to save in your retirement account, save for your future, of course. You want that tax savings, that helps. In addition to that, though, I do think people should have more brokerage accounts. I'm definitely big on like getting people in like using after-tax money investing.
Yeah, well, let's talk about like your controversial opinion and also like for you, what kind of and related to just your personal story you felt at one point, like looking back, that you put too much money in a 401k.
Yes. So my controversial opinion is that you probably shouldn't max your 401k. Don't get me wrong. There are exceptions, which we can get into. But I think the issue is, most personal finance experts across the board have just said like max your 401k, max your 401k, max your 401k. No one's actually run the numbers. How big is that? There's a benefit to using a 401k over just taking that money, having it in a taxable account like a brokerage account. There is a difference there, right? Because there is some sort of like tax savings or tax alpha, as they would call it, that you're going to get. I do some calculations and it's roughly around, 0.7% a year, right? And that's not nothing. Don't get me wrong. That compound over a long time can be a lot of money. The problem though is that figure doesn't include your all-in 401k fees, the fees you're paying on, because remember in a 401k, you can't choose the option. So if you happen to pick like investment funds, or funds in there that are more expensive than what you could get on the outside, like you can get a low cost US stock S&P 500 index fund for like 0.05%. So if by chance, let's say your fund costs like 0.7%, and remember there's a 0.7% benefit, that means basically all of the benefit of having that in a 401k is wiped out because you're paying it in fees. And that doesn't include like the all-in 401k fees. If you don't know the fees, I would talk to someone in HR and say, hey, can someone explain this to me and like walk me through all the fees and stuff? And if they don't know, they should probably go to someone and they'll probably get that information back to you. But it's good to know that because then you realize like, oh my gosh, like there's so many Americans out there in 401k plans that are maxing out right now, and they don't realize that the fees they're paying is larger than the expected benefit they're going to get. So what that means is they should probably take that money and then have it on the outside in a brokerage account, and then they could better invest it in cheaper funds and have more money in the end than by locking it up into a bad plan, basically.
And so that takes into account the tax savings that someone is saving from so with the pre-tax retirement account, like it reduces your taxable income when you're investing in like a 401k. So is that benefit take into account the tax savings on that?
This is where it's a little more complex because there's technically two layers of taxation, right? So there's the traditional 401k that we all know, and then there's the Roth 401k. Now, what's the difference? With the traditional, you take that money, you put it into the account, and it doesn't count as your taxable income. So you don't have to pay anything to the IRS on that money, right? With the Roth, you pay your taxes to the IRS, and then you take the money after you paid those taxes, and then you put it in. I'm talking about the Roth specifically. And why does this matter? Because that 0.7% annual tax benefit I'm talking about is avoiding capital gains. That's the real benefit you're going to get in a 401k. That's like easily measurable, because whether you do a traditional or a Roth, like paying tax now versus paying tax later, you're going to pay income tax, right? So I make this assumption that your income taxes are the same over time. That's not necessarily true. The problem is we can't predict future income taxes. I always thought like, oh, income taxes are going up, so you should do Roth, right? Because you want to pay the lower tax now instead of the higher tax later. I thought that in 2012. Then guess what? The 2017, Tax Cut and Jobs Acts come out and tax rates go down. So it's hard to predict tax policy. And I think it's difficult to be like, okay, well, I'm going to play this tax game where I'm going to try and guess. So I'm just like, let's just assume tax rates are constant over your life such that like if you do Roth or traditional, it doesn't make a difference, right, on your 401k. So like, let's put that piece aside because that's happening separately, right? So assuming you've already paid your tax, right, that's already happened. The income tax has to be paid no matter what, whether you put that into a brokerage account or a Roth or a traditional, the income tax has to be paid. You can't avoid that. But what the 401k does, it allows you to avoid the capital gains tax, right? As I talked about earlier, if you have $100, you gain 10%, it goes to 110. You sell it after a year, that's like a 15% tax you're going to owe, right? And that's what the rates are now. For most people, it's about 15% tax. You pay that $10, you pay the 15%, so you give the $150 to the government and you keep the $850, right? So if that was in a 401k, when you sold it, you wouldn't have to pay any of that $150. You keep all $10. Instead of keeping $850, you keep the full $10, right? the idea is like that little 15% over time, that's about, 0.7% a year, 70 basis points as they call it, right? So it's almost 1% a year. So that's the tax alpha I'm talking about. So if those fees are high enough in the 401k, it completely negates that capital gains. Like it's better for you to pay capital gains in a brokerage account, right? That 15% over the long haul than it is for you to go and pay 1% a year on your funds in a 401k. So that's it. And technically the argument, this is even more, if we really want to get into it, I actually kind of overlooked this and I should have included it in the book. But if we really want to get into it, like, I don't know if you know this, but a single person with no other income, if you only have capital gains, right? That's your only source of income is capital gains, right? You have no other income, you can have $50,000 a year tax-free. So let's say you have, let's say you have $1 million invested and it's paying you a 5% yield a year. Of course, this is kind of outrageous. No, nothing's paying 5% a year, but let's just say it is $1 million in the stock market and it's paying you 5% a year. You can have that as capital gains and you pay 0% tax on that. That is it's like 40,000 plus the standard deduction. It's about 50. So for a couple, you could have $100,000 a year tax free. So imagine that. Now compare your 401k plan and now compare that to putting it in a brokerage account where you can have $100,000 a year and it's just sending you money tax free, 0% tax rate. That is in the tax law. You can look this up. You guys obviously have to have a lot of money invested to have $100,000 in income coming in on capital gains, but that's a whole nother. I didn't even get into that in the book. If you include that like it really kind of says like, do you really want to max? Like I think everyone should go up to the match, and after that you need to really think about it because of course I talked about a lot of numbers. I didn't even get into the flexibility option. Like what if you need the money for something? Like for example, if I wanted to buy a place in Manhattan right now, I just couldn't because like the down payments are so large. Like it's going to take me a few more years to get there because I put so much more money into my 401k because I maxed because everyone said so. So on top of the flexibility, I don't think the financial benefit, the tax alpha, as I call it, is that large that it's going to make sense for a lot of people. So I'm saying like, just hit the match, no matter what, get your employer match. And after that, keep the money outside. It's a little bit more flexible. That's my take.
Okay. I love it. And I don't want to like beat this any more. Like, I just want to like make a point and or just say that I know when some people in the financial independence community, like what they're doing is they're assuming that their income in retirement is going to be less, so that they're just banking on, let me just like make all the money I can now, but have a tax rate that's lower or my tax rate is higher now. So or my income is higher now. I'm kind of reduce what my taxable income is. And then I'll worry about getting my money out in the future when I need it, because I'm going to be earning less in early retirement or retirement. That's kind of the assumption that like I went in, and it was just like, I'll worry about it later. But I think everything you said, and you can definitely like respond or like have a point to that, is kind of like, this is why it's important to, follow the rules of thumbs and like do certain things. But now you have to like do a more analysis based on your scenario, based on your life. And then even like talk to a financial planner or an advisor who you can ask these questions to specific to your situation and can help you kind of run these scenarios.
That's exactly correct. This is why I hate writing on taxes, and I may never do it again, because everything is about your personal situation. You're completely right. If you, for example, let's say you live in California and New York right now, high tax states, state income tax is high, but you know you're going to retire in a low income state, let's say Texas or Florida, and let's just assume state income taxes stay constant forever. That's a huge benefit because you'd want to avoid the tax now, so you'd have a traditional 401k now, avoid the tax now, and then in retirement you pull it out and you don't have to pay state income tax, right? So you can see that's like a little state income tax arbitrage where in that case it would make more sense to max out. That's probably worth more than that little tax alpha thing I was talking about. So I just wanted to raise awareness around this issue and just to be a little bit more open about it, because when every single person says max out your 401k, I think it's a problem. And I think it's like, let's really look at this. And like, I just want people to question it. No one's ever questioned it. And that's what I'm trying to do here. But I completely agree with you. It depends on a lot of factors. You're right. If you're going to be pulling out 20 grand a year, but right now you're making 120 grand a year, it makes sense probably to max your 401k, because when you're pulling out 20 grand in retirement, the marginal tax rates then, even if tax rates go up, are probably going to be lower than the tax rates you're going to be paying now, right? So I completely agree on all those sectors, and for a lot of people, it could even make sense to max 401k if tax rates were to increase a lot in the future. Like for everyone, it would make sense. Or if capital gains were to double, then yes, my whole analysis is junk now, right? So like there's so many factors. I'm saying right now with the current information I have, I'm not sure it's right for everyone. And that's kind of, I just want to open that possibility up. I'm not saying I'm right forever. I'm just possibly a little right now. That's all.
Yeah. Well, listen, we're critical thinkers here, and everyone listening is a critical thinker. So this is just like encouraging you to dig deeper and think more about like your money and your investments. One thing you mentioned in the book, I really like the way you said this, but I'd love for you to explain it, is that you say we begin our lives as growth stocks and then we end our lives as value stocks. What does that mean?
Yeah, so just a quick refresher. Growth stocks are those stocks that have very high expectations, like you expect a lot from them, and that's why their prices get bid up a lot. And you can think of like, everyone probably can think of stocks that were like kind of peaking in November 2021, like, or even before that. Like there's a lot of stocks that are really high. The Pelotons of the world, the Zooms, all these things that have high growth, everything's happening. Oh, the pandemic happened. All these stocks are going to the moon. And then value stocks are those that have been beaten down very badly and no one thinks there's anything's going to come good from them. But there's usually these positive upside surprises, like, oh, it wasn't as bad as I thought. And so then these stocks tend out. So that's why value stocks historically over very long periods of time have outperformed growth stocks, because like growth gets, really highly valued and then those expectations usually don't happen. They come down, and value stocks are very beaten down, but then there's upside surprises. So over the long haul, values being growth. Recently, that's not necessarily true, but over the long haul, that's true. And how does that relate to our lives? And I said, we begin our lives as growth stocks, we end our lives as value stocks. If you look at some of the happiness data, there's a lot of people, especially in like your early 20s, you have all these expectations for where you expect your life to be when you're 30, 35, 40, whatever. And the researchers find that everyone's like just makes these really crazy forecasting errors. They think they're going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread. And then it finds out like, oh, life doesn't turn out that way. Maybe you aren't, you want to be married with kids and have, a house and all these things or be famous. And none of that ends up happening. Just a couple of those things happen maybe, right? So your life doesn't turn out what it has to be. And that's fine. I'm saying most people don't meet their expectations. In my case, I remember when I was like 23, I knew like Warren Buffett had $1 million by the time he was 30. And I was like, you know what? I want to have $500,000. Remember, by the time he was 30, $1 million, like adjust for inflation was like 9 million. So I didn't even adjust for inflation and I cut it in half. I said, I should be able to get to $500,000 by the time I'm 30. It should be good. And I hit 31 and I still wasn't worth $500,000. So like sometimes we don't hit our expectations. Like that happens. It's okay. It's not the worst thing in the world. But then the good thing though is like people start to have that, midlife crisis, that's that middle slump. And, they expect life's going to get worse. But actually, a lot of people, you see that happiness kind of starts to go up over time. Right? As you get older, it starts to go up. And so there's kind of like that, we end our lives as value stocks. And like we expect things to be, terrible and we're all beaten down. Yet, life ends up giving us some upside surprise, whether that's grandchildren or children or some sort of something in life that gives us some sort of upside. And so I think that's the thing to think about is like, hey, it's okay if you haven't gotten to where you want to be, especially on your financial journey. But like over the long term, like generally you'll end up finding more upside surprises than maybe you'd expect. So stay in the game, basically.
All right. See, we ended it on a positive note. We ultimately we'll be value stocks people. We'll be okay. So Nick, thank you so much for coming on this show. Please tell everyone where they can find out more about you, your blog, and your new book.
Yeah, so you guys can, if anyone wants to DM me, you can find me on Twitter at $and-Data, or you can DM me at Instagram. It's Nick Maggiulli. Just make sure to spell it right. I have imposters, so just Maggiulli. Yeah, you can find me at my blog of $and-Data.com, and you can find my book, Just Keep Buying, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc. So thank you guys for your time. Appreciate your time, Journeyers.
And I will link all of that in the episode show notes. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Don't forget, you can get the episode show notes for this episode by going to journeytolaunch.com or click the description of wherever you're listening to this. And you can still grab your Jumpstart Guide for free to help you on your journey to financial freedom by going to journeytolaunch.com/jumpstart. If you want to support me and the podcast and love the free content and information that you get here are 4 ways that you can support me and the show. 1, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast wherever you listen, whether that's Apple Podcasts, that purple app on your phone, your Android device, YouTube, Spotify, wherever it is that you happen to listen, just subscribe so you are not missing an episode. And if you're happening to listen to this in Apple Podcasts, rate, review, and subscribe there. I appreciate and read every single review. Number 2, follow me on my social media accounts. I'm at Journey to Launch on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and I love interacting with journeyers there. 3, support and check out the sponsors of this show if you hear something that interests you. Sponsors are the main ways we keep the podcast lights on here, so show them some love for supporting your girl. 4, and last but not least, share this episode, this podcast with a friend or family member or coworker so that we can spread the message of Journey to Launch. All right, that's it. Until next week, keep on journeying, journeyers.